Secretary Wolfowitz. Chairman Graham, Chairman Goss, members of this committee, you have long provided our country strong leadership and bipartisan support, especially now as we wage this war against terrorism. You demonstrate by example that America's security transcends party or politics. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss with you today some Defense Department perspectives on the very important role of intelligence. I'll keep my comments brief, as I believe my primary purpose today is to respond to your particular questions. Let me first say that our thoughts and prayers are with the families of the victims of last September's attacks. Last week, on the anniversary of the Pentagon attack, I was privileged to take part in a ceremony honoring those men and women who labored so diligently and tirelessly over the last year to rebuild the Pentagon. I was able on that occasion to meet with some of the family members of the victims, and while they too rejoiced in the outward healing that has taken place in the Pentagon since that day, it was all too evident that there is a hole in their hearts, and many others, a hole that will never heal, and we grieve with them at their loss. But seeing those family members whose lives were so fundamentally changed 1 year ago served also to renew the commitment of each person who works in the Pentagon, military and civilian, to carry out our department's mission in this war that we wage to prevent future acts of terrorism. Yesterday, before a different committee in the Congress, Secretary Rumsfeld addressed a dimension of this war against terrorism, referring to valuable intelligence information we already possess. He referred to President Bush, who said last week at the United Nations, and I quote, "We know that Saddam Hussein pursued weapons of mass murder even when inspectors were in his country. Are we to assume that they stopped when he left?" The Secretary concluded, to the contrary, knowing what we know about Iraq's history, no conclusion is possible except that they have and are accelerating their WMD programs. Secretary Rumsfeld went on to observe that there are many now who are asking hundreds of questions about what happened on September 11th, poring over thousands of pages of documents and asking who knew what, when, and why they didn't prevent that tragedy. And he concluded, and I quote, "I suspect that in retrospect, most of those investigating September 11th would have supported preventive action to preempt that threat if it had been possible to see it coming." He went on to make the point that if one were to compare the scraps of information that the government had before September 11th to the volumes that we have today about Iraq's pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, its history of aggression and hostility toward the United States, and factor in our country's demonstrated vulnerability after September 11th, the case that the President made should be clear. And the Secretary then added, "We cannot go back in time to stop the September 11th attack, but we can take actions now to prevent some future threats." And of course, that is precisely why we are here today, to examine how we can all work together to prevent future threats to our nation. From the beginning, President Bush emphasized that the United States would fight this war using every element of national power, from diplomatic and law enforcement to intelligence and military elements. And certainly, one of the most important elements of national power, one that we rely on every day now to help us in this war on terrorism, is the U.S. intelligence community. As evidenced by this hearing, these committees are well aware of the fundamental importance of intelligence to our national security and have long been dedicated to providing bipartisan support for critical intelligence programs. 4 years ago, I was privileged to serve on the Rumsfeld Commission, which was charged with reporting to Congress on its assessment of the ballistic missile threat to the United States. One of the underlying focuses of our study was, of course, intelligence. When the Commission released its report in 1998, its 9 commissioners, which were an almost even mix of Democrats and Republicans, holding a very wide range of views on policy, unanimously concluded that U.S. analyses, and I quote, "practices and policies that depend on expectations of extended warning of deployment be reviewed and, as appropriate, revised to reflect the reality of an environment in which there may be little or no warning," end quote. While that conclusion came out of an assessment geared toward the ballistic missile threat, it was understood by each commissioner that the conclusion was applicable to all intelligence-related issues. This was an understanding, I think, shared by those to whom we presented our findings, since members of Congress subsequently requested an intelligence side letter that elaborated on the Commission's concerns and had some recommendations for change. First, according to the side letter, it was evident to all the commissioners that resources for intelligence had been cut too deeply and that the United States was entering a period in which the intelligence community was going to be seriously challenged to meet its foremost task, preventing surprise. Second, one of the primary weapons in the endless struggle against surprise is knowing what our enemies don't want us to know. U.S. intelligence capabilities needed to succeed in this task, the letter concluded, were not as robust as they needed to be. Third, when there is more ambiguity in the intelligence material, the system becomes more dependent on analytic resources to discern the potential for surprise. The letter highlighted that in methodological approach, analytic depth, and presentation to users, the intelligence community was in a degraded situation. Following those conclusions, Congress responded with a significant increase in funding for intelligence in the fiscal year 1999 budget. Despite the best efforts of this committee, however, those increases were not sustained in fiscal years 2000 or 2001. At the time of the attacks last September, the Defense Department was preparing a significant increase for intelligence in the fiscal year 03 budget. And after the attacks, this figure was doubled to the present proposal. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, in my prepared statement, which I would encourage you to read, there's a very prescient passage from Thomas Schelling's foreword to Roberta Wohlstedter's superb book about Pearl Harbor, Warning and Surprise. And it underscores that some of the difficulties that we are analyzing today about our ability to discern intelligence, to find signals and noise, to deal with projecting our own assumptions about rationality on enemies that have different assumptions about rationality, are problems that go back in practically every comparable incident in history and will probably be endemic to the intelligence process. We can work at reducing them, but we can't eliminate them. One of the most telling lines from Schelling is that the danger, he said, is in a poverty of expectations, a routine obsession with a few dangers that may be familiar rather than likely. The expectation of the familiar must not guide us as we move forward. Rather, the unfamiliar and the unlikely must be our new guides. With this in mind, let me discuss briefly some lessons from September 11th. First, for the past 50 years, U.S. intelligence has concentrated on defeating external nation-state threats. It is now clear that we must apply the same level of effort to non-state actors and threats that emanate from within our borders. Second, when people threaten openly to kill Americans, we should take them very seriously. That is true of Osama bin Laden, and it is true of the regime in Baghdad. We must not assume that our enemies share our views about what is rational or irrational. Third, we should not underestimate the skill of our enemies or their determination to conceal their activities and deceive us. They understand how we collect intelligence, how we are organized, and how we analyze information. Just like them, our intelligence services must constantly adapt and innovate. Thus, we have aggressive efforts underway to find new ways to discern those terrorist signals from the background noise of our society. But we must also recognize that enemies will deliberately create noise in our system in order to conceal their real signals. Fourth, we need to adapt our intelligence system to the information age. Old stovepipes are being broken down and must be broken down. The culture of compartmentation is being reconsidered and must be reconsidered. In all that we do, we must emphasize speed of exchange and networking to push information out to people who need it, when they need it, wherever they are. Fifth, while we must always work to improve our intelligence, we should never allow ourselves to believe that we can rely exclusively upon intelligence for our security. We should expect surprise and have capabilities that do not depend on perfect intelligence to defend the nation. As Secretary Rumsfeld observed yesterday, we have had numerous gaps of 2, 4, 6, or 8 years between the time a country of concern first developed a weapons of mass destruction capability and the time we finally learned about it. Efforts are underway that will ultimately result in the transformation of our intelligence posture. Our current sources and methods depreciated badly over the last decade, and sorely needed investments were postponed. Our budgets have been substantially increased, but we are playing catch-up. There is no question that we need to recapitalize and introduce new sources of intelligence and novel methods of collecting and analyzing information. But our intelligence sources and methods have also been devaluated by a pattern of leaks from the executive and legislative branches of government and through a number of well-known espionage cases. Leaks and espionage have provided our adversaries over time with an unfortunately good picture of what we know and how we know it. One well-known incident involves the unauthorized disclosure of information that led Osama bin Laden to stop using a satellite phone that we had been monitoring. Once that information was out in public, we never heard again from that satellite phone. Culture and doctrine. A culture of excessive compartmentation will hinder our ability to defeat new threats. We need to facilitate greater sharing of information and collaboration with and between intelligence agencies, including law enforcement agencies and analysts and collectors. At the same time, it is true that compartmentation is necessary to prevent compromise of sources and methods. Global terrorism now forces domestic and foreign intelligence systems to link together to prevent the enemy from finding a hiding place in the seam between our disciplines. It means that we have to work together between the executive and legislative branches, within the executive branch, with foreign intelligence services, to redefine the relationships and the rules. And we must also accelerate the speed with which information is passed to policymakers and operators. Finally, we need to avoid the mistake of thinking that intelligence estimates reached by consensus should routinely trump those of a lone dissenting voice. They do not. During World War II, the U.S. and Britain assembled our best minds to crack the German code. Those code breakers, assembled in England at a place called Bletchley Park, defied the odds, accomplishing their vital mission faster than anyone expected. In so doing, they hastened the demise of Nazi Germany and the end of the war. As we seek to defeat terrorists and their supporters, our intelligence culture must renew that sense of urgency in collecting and mining and analyzing intelligence. With respect to organization, we need to continue to update a Cold War intelligence structure to better address 21st century threats. We are already taking steps to get our Defense Department house in order and have proposed to the Congress the creation of an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence to streamline and integrate disparate DoD intelligence activities. That Undersecretary is intended to provide the Department with a single staff office to oversee the various intelligence programs and will support the existing relationship between the Director of Central Intelligence and senior DoD officials and provide a focal point for securing timely and effective support for the DCI from the Defense Intelligence Establishment. This change will permit us to accelerate a large number of actions that are already underway. As members of this committee know, many of them are very highly classified, but there are a number that are mentioned in my statement, and that is there for the record. We also need to address a relatively new problem, what I would call information discovery. Many agencies collect intelligence, and lots of agencies analyze intelligence, but no one is responsible for the bridge between collection and analysis, for tagging, cataloging, indexing, storing, retrieving, and correlating data, or facilitating collaboration involving many different agencies. Given the volume of information that we must sift through to separate signals from noise, this function is now critical. There is much that we can do to exploit the full benefits of new information technologies, such as data mining and change detection, as well as the steadily decreasing cost of data storage. But partly because of the inescapable need for security of information, the intelligence world lags behind the private sector in its ability to tag and store massive amounts of data and to mine that information to determine patterns. And one more issue we must consider is how we consider need to know. We have to break down the access to information so that those who need it get access to it. It is interesting to recall that before Pearl Harbor, the ultra-secret code-breaking operation called MAGIC, one of the most remarkable achievements in American intelligence history, had unlocked the most secret Japanese communications. But that operation was considered so secret and so vulnerable to compromise that the distribution of its product was restricted to the point that our field commanders in Pearl Harbor didn't make the need-to-know list. But it is easy to say in hindsight that this information should have been shared more widely. If it had been, and if it had been compromised as a result, we would have been asking ourselves why it was shared so widely. In closing, I'd like to emphasize 3 points. First, as I mentioned, the President has said that the United States would fight this war using every element of national power, from diplomatic and law enforcement to intelligence and military elements, with America's military power by no means necessarily the first option, but one of a vast array of national resources with which to fight. Certainly one of the most important elements in fighting this war of the shadows involves the U.S. intelligence community and its extraordinary capabilities. Whatever is done to reform and improve our intelligence community should not do harm to its contribution to the current war effort. Second, no matter how good intelligence can be, we will not win this war simply by going after individual terrorists. We must not only capture and kill terrorists and break up individual plots, but we must drain the swamp in which terrorists breed. In February of 1998, Osama bin Laden published a fatwa declaring his intent to kill Americans, a fact which leads to my third conclusion. When our professed enemies declare that they intend to kill us, we should take them at their word and prepare accordingly. We must avoid the temptation of believing that the truth can only be found through classified sources. To do otherwise, despite warnings and signs, would indeed constitute a grave intelligence failure. Secretary Rumsfeld testified yesterday to some of the signs and signals that now abound, saying that we are on notice. Let there be no doubt, he said, an attack will be attempted. The only question is when and by what technique. It could be months, a year, or several years, but it will happen. If the worst were to happen, not one of us here today will be able to honestly say it was a surprise, because it will not be a surprise. We have connected the dots, he said, as much as it is humanly possible before the fact. Only by waiting until after the event could we have proof positive. The dots are there for all to see. The dots are there for all to connect. If they aren't good enough, rest assured they will only be good enough after another disaster, a disaster of still greater proportions, and by then it will be too late. We cannot afford to wait, the Secretary put it, until we have a smoking gun, for a gun smokes only after it's been fired. We appreciate this committee's dedication to accomplish meaningful, positive, and constructive measures with regard to America's intelligence community. We appreciate your continued bipartisan leadership and guidance, and we look forward to working with you in your important task of looking to the future to improve America's intelligence capability. Thank you.